Morning, everyone. You had a terrific week? Well, I hope you have. Yes. That's good. You know, over the last few weeks, it reminds you of how quickly our world changes. You know, with Russia invading Ukraine, and you're reminded again of how lucky we are living in this part of the world. And but I was staggered with what happened with the protests in Canada. Their bank accounts of the protesters were seized and frozen. Children were taken off them, and they seized the $8 million that was given in GoFundMe to help the protesters. And you sort of think, we used to live in a free world. And this is Canada. One of the bastions of the free world, a Commonwealth country, and you sort of go, what's happened? It just sort of gives you a glimpse of how quickly things could change. When you protest, even in New Zealand, you're told not to protest, even though Jacinda Ardern supported the right to protest, and not just a couple of years before, and so when things go against the government, things can change rapidly. So, not wanting to make bigger than what it is, but it just demonstrates how quickly things can change. And that's what we need to be aware of, but it's not so much how soon, but it's how we wait before the second coming that is critical. Anyway, just before I open up with my illustration this morning, this is not about the drink. This is about what happened around the drink. So if you get sort of frightened about this, I just want to explain what happened in the 1980s, and it's a fascinating thing. So I don't think that this is chicken church or Coke church or anything like this, and needs to be something on YouTube. But it was back in the early 1980s that Pepsi ran what they called the Pepsi Challenge. And so they went around throughout the United States saying, this is a Pepsi Challenge, take a sip. And as they sort of took a sip, and yeah, this is nice. And so because so many people were taking the Pepsi Challenge, it created a life of its own that dramatically impacted on the sales of Coke. What was happening in the 1970s, Coke had the share of the soft drink market of around about 18%, and Pepsi only had the share of about 4%. So there was a big difference. And, the Yanks love their soft drink, big time. And so 1 percentage point difference meant literally millions of dollars. Now, with the Pepsi Challenge that had gained momentum, it dropped from about 12% to about 10%. So there was only a couple of percentage points difference. And so the executives were saying, come on guys, what's happening here? We got twice as many vending machines around the country. We have twice as much shelving space in the supermarkets. Why are we losing sales? Maybe it is the flavour. And they said, well, maybe the Pepsi research is wrong. So Coke then embarked on a research, and they did it privately, of course, the Coke Challenge. Take a sip. And what they found, it confirmed what Pepsi was finding. People enjoyed Pepsi more. This then threw the Coke executives into a real spin. So they started to muck around with the recipe. A little bit more sugar, a little bit less of that, because it's all secret, you know. So I don't know what they put in it, 11 spices or what. Wrong product. Anyway, got to get your right product, you know. Anyway, they started to muck around with it, but they did sweeten it up. And so this took about, a year or two. And so now they did the new Coke challenge here. And he went, yeah, this tastes real good. And so once they got the recipe right, they did the research, not just with thousands of people, literally hundreds of thousands of people in America. They did the Coke challenge and they all did the sip test and they said, yep. So, and the executives thought, we have found the right recipe. We're now ready to launch with the new Coke and change for the best. And so back, I think it was in 1984, out comes with the new Coke. The executives sat back there and thought, you beauty, we've done the right thing here. And with all this research of hundreds of thousands of sippers, we can't fail. How could they fail? But they did. Big time. Only in America, of course. There were massive protests over the new recipe. This is just a soft drink, people, but this is obviously very important. But there were protests outside Coke itself and protests all over America about this new recipe of Coke. This is terrible, they said. And they went, what's gone wrong here? So within about 3 months, they brought back the classic Coke. And the classic Coke was the original recipe within 3 months. What went wrong? Surely, you remember the days when they used to have sips at supermarkets and taste testers? And you sort of go, yep, no, that's good. Well, there's a whole different way of thinking when it just comes to a sip. And compared to sort of drinking the whole lot, what the executives found was, when they did research on it, was when that you take a slab of Coke, a 12-pack of Coke home, and you're sitting there in front of the TV and you drink the whole can, you have immersed yourself in the whole can, and it's a whole different experience to that of just sipping. So the whole sipping thing was a big failure in of itself. Pepsi focused on the younger people who liked it sweeter. Coke the executives have lost faith in their product and started tinkering with the recipe. Whereas the product itself, I'm not making an advert for a Coke, but this is the marketing thing, okay? Just for all the YouTube listeners there. But, they're not making it, the mystique around the product of Coke and the secrecy of the recipe and the reputation of Coke they had lost sight of. And as a result, they then tinkered with the recipe. They should have maintained the faith in their product. Too many people take a sip of Christianity, just a little bit, just a tiny wee bit, instead of drinking and immersing their entire selves into Christianity. And like the people who took the Coke home and drank the whole can, they experienced the drink and liked it far better than just a sip. When we immerse ourselves fully in Christianity, we then experience the fullness of God's love and His transformative presence in our lives. We cannot afford to sip Christianity. And what I mean by that is just take a little bit of Christianity and a little bit or mostly of my own life, and I just tag on a few beliefs here and there, and hunky-dory, and she'll be right, mate. Doesn't work like that. In order for us to survive, in order for our Christianity to survive, we need to experience the fullness of God's grace, and as we do that, we serve Him and we experience His transformative presence. And I want to share a little bit of a historical story. You like a bit of history, don't you? I know all you people at school used to hate history, but you remember this bloke here. Anyone know who this bloke is? William Miller. Now, he was a person who fully immersed himself into Christianity, and it was a gradual process, but when he led the Great Awakening, as historians have called it, he devoted himself fully into it, but it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always like that. Now, there's some interesting things that were happening in America in the late 1700s that helped to bring to bear in the world in which William Miller was raised in, that help us to understand the challenges that he faced in sharing the good news. Now, in America, they had, in the late 1700s, they just completed the Revolutionary War, and at that time they were threw out all the rules of society, in the sense of that they were thrown off the Commonwealth of England and the Primate of England, and so now they were setting their new direction for the United States, and they were having a new style of government that they had to settle on, and out of the revolution there was enormous changes that were happening in America. And one of the interesting things with America was that we think America was a Christian country at that time. Not really. Not really. Yes, the church was strong, but the pervading intellectual ideas that were around at that time was the belief in deism. Now, deism, you go, what on earth is deism? Well, it's something that most people believe today. Oh yeah, God exists, but He is at a distance. All right. So in the governing documents of the states, they will have things like creator, providence, things that will make recognition of God, but He is distant. And so people like Washington, Adams, Jefferson, all the big names of the states were deists. Believed in God, but He's distant. Very important, because that was the world in which Miller was raised in. Now, there was something else that was really surprising. In America in 1796, they signed a peace treaty with the Muslim states and Barbary states and off Libya. In Article 11, they said, we are not a Christian country. Well, anyway, that caused all historians to have conniptions, because they said, oh, it is a Christian country. Well, they had Christian ideas, Christian notions, but that was it. The other fascinating thing was, so you got belief in God, well, He's distant. You got this idea of, yeah, we got Christian ideas, but they had this other idea of the world is getting better. And there was what they called Millennial Fever arose. Don't put the Adventist eyes on that one because it's a totally different belief. The Millennial Fever that was happening around about that time was that the world is getting better because we're done with the revolution. We've got a new form of government, democracy, economy booming. People are getting better and dressing nicer as well. And with Millennial Fever was that what happens is they were expecting God 1,000 years of peace, then Christ would come. That was a Millennial Fever. William Miller, who himself believed that God was at a distance, and that was called what again? Deism. He was raised a Baptist, and the restraint of religion was starting to lose its hold in his teenage years as he was reading books, and to his father's consternation, and he caught him one night reading the book, because he used to sneak wood and to stoke the fire, and he would sneak down late at night and he would be reading the book, and his father thought that the house was on fire and raced down and caught him reading. Well, did he get what for? But anyway, that was what he was like. He was one of 16 children. Whew. So you got a free labour for the farm and that sort of thing, and that's what they were expected to do, was to work the farm over. But anyway, the restraint of religion started to wear off, and he became a great exponent of deism. God at a distance, great idea, have a few principles. And so this was their view of a secular society. William Miller was a respected person after he was married and settled down, and in the town people looked to him as a upstanding member of the community with a great reputation and a good person. Now, cracks started to form in his view of deism when just before he went into the army, and he thought, well, if we go into the army, we'll sort this out. After his time in serving, he became disillusioned with human nature because he didn't see that the world was getting better. Yeah, people might be dressing nicer and that sort of thing, but human nature was exactly the same, but just dressed prettier or differently. So he decided to start to search the Bible for the next 5 years. So I was around about 1816, somewhere about then. So for the next 5 years, he started to search the Bible, and he had 20 tenets of faith as he just used the Bible and the concordance. And tenet number 15 was Jesus is coming back on or before 1843. Now, what do you do with that? Well, this goes completely against the grain of society. You know, when you predict the second coming, this bloke's a Fruit Loop. And William Miller didn't want to have to put up with that. He knew that this belief in 1843 of Jesus coming back on or before, he then spent the next 8 years checking all the objections to that. So it wasn't until around about 1831 did he start to preach openly about it. But the fact that he realised that preaching that Jesus was going to come back on or before 1843, people are going to view him as a complete nutter. Remember, he had a good reputation in the community. He was intelligent, well-read. People looked up to him. He would lose his reputation. He would lose his status. And the pervading view of the world was millennial fever, 1,000 years of peace on earth. So that goes completely against that. And that God is at a distance. Well, Miller didn't believe that now. Do you see that William Miller in his beliefs that he was having to go against the grain of the world in which he lived in. We think that because it was a Christian nation, it was all pretty easy. No, it wasn't. And because when William Miller, he thought initially everybody would be happy to hear it, but then he sort of realised that even his local doctor said he was a model maniac. That's what you call affirmation. So when the doctor came around and he said, well, you examine me then. I'll pay you your doctor's fee for 2 hours to examine me. And anyway, William Miller went all through what he had found out in that tenet number 15 and demonstrated in the Bible. And at the end of 2 hours, the doctor left angry. Came back the next day and says, I'm not ready. How do I get ready? After a week, the doctor became a model maniac. William Miller then, in 1831, began to preach. He didn't want to do it. He was hoping somebody else would do it. He then would share the message with the preacher, hoping that he would take up the cause. Then in the end, he says, this message has to go out. He was convicted. All right, Lord, I'm not going to seek any preaching appointments. You've got to arrange it. Well, the little kid was already on his way. He had already departed the house from his house sometime before. In 30 minutes, knock on the door. You got a preaching appointment next Sunday. And that started off the Great Awakening. The thing that made William Miller's Christian experience real was that he totally immersed himself into the message. He didn't take a sip. This was no sipping here. In order for him to get through this, all these dynamics of what was happening in the world at that time, going against the grain, losing his reputation, in order to survive that, he had to fully immerse himself. No sipping at all. Because he suffered persecution. He never got paid. Not one of his trips to a Sunday church, he never got enough money to cover that trip. And the equivalent of the times, he spent tens of thousands of dollars on going and preaching around this. So it wasn't for his own benefit. How are we going to survive the last days? We've given a glimpse. Canada, wars, rumours of wars, earthquakes, famines, pestilences. This is only just a start. How are we going to survive? What I have discovered is that Adventist faith through this pandemic has been pretty weak. Some have thrown off their faith. Some have come up with ridiculous ideas. How is our faith going to survive? William Miller was able to immerse himself, so we need to as well. Let me just give you a wee glimpse of this as we go to Matthew chapter 25. Now, Matthew chapter 25, Jesus was talking about the second coming, and in the last half a dozen or in the verses of chapter 24 and verse 42 is the start of 4 stories that gives us glimpses on what is required of us just before the second coming. And so the first parable talks about Jesus coming back as a thief, and so that one talks about responsibility. The parable of the wise and the foolish virgins talks about readiness. And we're going to have a wee look at the talents, which looks at productivity. And the last one, the sheep and the goats, talks about accountability. So talks about all sorts of things and what is required of his people just before the second coming, or before he comes again. So we're going to have a look at the parable of the talents, which looks at productivity. Now I know you know this parable very well, but it's an important parable because there's a very important question that we need to ask ourselves of it. So if we just read from verse 14, and so Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14 says this. All right. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each one according to his own ability. And he went on a journey. And immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. And in the same manner, the one who had received 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of the slaves came and settled the accounts with them. And the one who had received 5 talents came up and bought 5 talents, saying, Master, you have entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter in the joy of the Lord. And also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents, and see, I've gained 2 more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful in a few things, and I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of the master. The one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy slave, you knew that I reap where I did not sow, and I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has more than shall be given, and to you have an abundance, but from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out this worthless slave into the outer darkness, and that place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Mate, that's a pretty hard-hitting parable, really, when you sort of break down some of the language that was used. And but the thing was with this, you had the one with 5 talents, 2 talents, and the one with 1. Clearly, the landowner was extremely wealthy, and he wanted to share his wealth with his people. He wanted to share it. Here's 5 talents. Go. And what was their response? Immediately they went out and became productive. And so when the master came back, gave 5. The one who got 2, what was their response? Immediately they went out. And so you sort of get the sense of they became productive straight away, and the response of the master was exactly the same as the one with 5 and 2. And so what they heard from the master was, Well done, good and faithful slave. Enter into the joy of the Lord. And so they would have heard those words and go, Wow, well done. And they would have felt terrific and fantastic. And so they both were affirmed for what they had done. And, you know, in many ways, the parable isn't any more complicated than that. Till we come to the final one, who only had one talent. And when he received that, he scurried away and buried it. And Jesus accosts him for, you didn't even give me any interest. He wasn't talking about the money changers in the temple who were ripping people off and charging absorbent interest, but there were another group of money changers, and they're the ones like you see at the airport, you know, for travellers who would change their money into new currency. And they provided a great service. And they would also loan as well, and they would charge. They were Gentiles. Gentiles were allowed to charge Jews interest. But he didn't. He buried it. And then when the master comes back, he unearths the talent, scrubs off the dirt and the grime, hands it back. And God says to him, you wicked and lazy person, you wicked and lazy person. Now, I want to read the passage in the Message translation. And Peterson words it like this. And so he's talking about this wicked servant who was brimming with emotion. And the servant giving 1,000, Master, I know you have high standards and hate careless ways, that you demand the best, no allowances for error. I was afraid I might disappoint you, so I found a good hiding place and secured your money. Here it is. It is safe and sound, down to the last cent. Master was furious. That's a terrible way to live. It's criminal to live cautiously like that. If you know I was after the best, why did you do less than the least? The least you could have done would have been to invest the sum with the bankers, where at least I would have gotten so little interest. Take that 1,000, give it to the one who risked the most, and get rid of this play it safe who won't go out on a limb. I really like Peterson's translation. I know it's a paraphrase, but there's some words that leap out. Play it safe. If we had to immerse ourselves into Christianity, we can't afford to play it safe. And he said it's a terrible way to live cautiously. If you knew I wanted the best, why did you do less than that? Wow, this is pretty hard-hitting stuff, isn't it? This parable here is talking about productivity of the Christians. And just want to share a quote with you here from Michael J. Jenkins, who's a theologian who wrote a terrific commentary on Matthew. And he says this of the wicked servant. And he says this, that the explicit problem with the wicked servant is his attitude about his master. This is the way that many people deal with God. Their wrong attitude about God. God is mean. God is unconcerned with our fate. Results in an excuse for disobedience to his calling. It can also be applied to Christians who develop wrong attitudes about God. They see God as unloving because of their circumstances, and they then depart from the path of obedience. But faithfulness, and this is really good here, the faithfulness is contingent on an accurate view of God. Inaccurate views of God allow us to rationalise our own irresponsibility and unfaithfulness. Thus, it is vitally important to have a correct biblical understanding of and perception of God's character, His activities and goals for us. That was the trouble for the wicked servant. And so, how do we drink deeply? Michael Jenkins says this, learn of his character. You know, if we have wrong perceptions of God's character, we'll have a wrong response, as the wicked servant did. They had a wrong perception of Christianity and of God back in the time of Miller. Deism, God is distant, he is unconcerned, he doesn't care about this world. What's the counter to that? What would we say? What would you say? How do we get a right conception of God's character? It comes simply from the Bible, firstly with an attitude from us that is willing to learn of his character. What is Jesus like? The best way to see what Jesus is like, read the Gospel of John, read one of the other Gospels, read Desire of Ages, see what his character is like. Philip, have I been with you for so long? He who's seen me has seen the Father. Philip didn't get it. We have got to see how much God loves his people, to how much he was willing to go to the cross. See how he treated people. Think about it. Immerse yourself in it. When we understand God's love and the depth of his love for us, this is a transforming experience, because though this parable talks about talents 5, 2 and 1, sounds like it's saved by works, doesn't it? Because there's an audit. You ever had an audit? You ever have someone go through your books? You know, we just don't like it by human nature. How dare you check up on me, pal? But this is what's happening here. But we are saved by grace, first and foremost. But when we are saved by grace, and when we immerse ourselves in God's grace, there we experience God's presence, and then we experience his transformative presence. Immediately they went out. Understand his character, and that comes from spending time and looking and understanding his character. Know and understand what we believe. I said to you earlier that too many of our Adventist folk have gone on with these stupid ideas that have come from YouTube, the internet, of all these other ideas. Oh, it's this. Immerse ourselves in the Bible and know what we believe. Don't go, I think it's this, I think it's that, and we sort of... No, know and understand what we believe. That gives us a foundation. Because if we don't, then when difficult times happen, our foundation is shaky at best. Know and understand what we believe. Don't assume that you know. Because I think sometimes we assume that we know a lot more than what we actually think. And constantly be open to learning and serve. Serve. See, the problem with the one talent person was only got one talent, one gift or one ability, or one trick pony. Did it matter to God? Didn't matter how many. God was wanting to distribute his wealth. And his wealth is found in the gospel and his message. But this person who had this talent, who said, I'm afraid. And when we're afraid, we We flee, we fight, or we're paralysed. I can't do that. Paralysed with fear, he was, or she, he, whatever. Paralysed with fear. And because of that, they couldn't do anything. Wrong conception of God. Oh, I've only got one talent. I am not like Peter Smith down the road or Aunt Mary who's got 5 talents, can do all this, this and this. Doesn't matter. Both were affirmed by God. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of the Lord. Doesn't matter how many. It's what we do with what we have. Too many of Adventists are afraid to serve because they're afraid of, well, so-and-so can do it much better. That person can sing much better. That person can do the lesson much better. It doesn't. We all learn as we serve. God equips. But we first have to be willing to lay our lives on the altar. The final thing is we've got to be prepared to go against the grain. William Miller had to go against the grain big time. He had to go against the grain of the reigning intelligentsia, the reigning philosophies, and the reigning teachings of the church. Many of the Millerites were thrown out of the church, and all of Miller's friends couldn't understand why he went back to the Bible. What are you doing, they would say to him. How could you believe that? And that's surprising in the early 1800s, when America was supposed to be such a Christian country. And you would think, as Miller thought initially, everyone would be happy to hear it. But they weren't. We as Seventh-day Adventist Christians have to be prepared to go against the grain. We live in a world that is seeking for a new meaning of society. Like America that was threw out the old rules of society, was looking for a new way and a new way to run the country. So we are living in a world at the moment where all the rules are gone out the window, and they're looking for a new sense of how do we find meaning in the secular world. And people are finding meaning in causes of justice and climate change and these sorts of causes in order to find meaning. When cause justice and causes for justice, as good as they often sound, if they are not plucked from the tree of life, they are cold and harsh, unforgiving and unloving. And if you're not convinced, just have a look at the Twitterati and you'll see biles of hatred in the cause of justice. Our society is looking for new meaning. The only meaning is found in Scripture, in God Himself, in His grace and in His love, and in the message of His soon coming, His death and resurrection. That is where we find meaning, not in all this other stuff that happens out there. That's where we find meaning. But that is not popular. Miller's message wasn't popular. Our message is not popular. As soon as Morrison just rears his head, you know he's a Christian, the Twitter just bag him and his wife. They bag his beliefs. Now, we may not agree with all his beliefs and that sort of thing, but that's not the point. The point is that Christianity is hated by our world. We must be prepared to go against the grain. And these are just a few little things that will help us to be able to drink deeply. Now, you may recognise the space shuttle, and this one was the Space Shuttle Challenger. And on January 28, 1986, it was being prepped for takeoff, and in its prep for takeoff, this was the crew that was chosen to go on it. And you can imagine the excitement of going out into space, and the privilege of being called to go out on the space shuttle. Mate, I'll be really excited too. And this was them as they were practicing some manoeuvres, and that was how to survive a space shuttle crash. Anyway, and this was them as they were heading towards the pad as they were about to take off. Now, that particular day, there was an awful lot of ice around, and they had a meeting as to whether they should actually take off that day. Many of the technicians and scientists were really surprised that said, yep, no, we'll go ahead with it. And which went against the grain of the people who were working on the ground. This is in Florida. You're surprised by the amount of ice in Florida? I certainly am. Well, it's January 28 and it can get pretty cold in Florida. So clearly they had a bitterly cold northerly wind, and but you might recall that one of the things that caused the space shuttle to collapse to explode was the seal, and there was the first signs of the seal that was broken. The problem was that the little O-ring, just an O-ring, that's all. The O-ring, because of the cold, was frozen and lacked the flexibility in the booster, which allowed the gases to go from one containment area to the other. And so obviously nobody would have picked up that cloud of puff of smoke, and mate, a lot of birds around that were but anyway, that was it taking off, and the people were looking on, and they were experiencing the joy of the shuttle taking off. And a friend of mine has seen the shuttle take off, and he said, it's a terrific sight to see. I would love to have seen it. And this here was the picture here of just moments before it was about to explode. And you can see that here she was about to go, and that's what happened at the end. And the capsule and where the astronauts were, they found that they were still alive at this point here. This is 73 seconds into the flight. Control didn't realise what had happened for about another minute. They said, well, we appear to have, communications are down at the moment. And the last word of the astronaut was, uh-oh. That was the last word, uh-oh. At this point, most of them would have still been alive, because they found a couple of switches that had been activated at this point, which you would only activate at that point in order to restart the electricals. And also they had activated their oxygen, which was an unpressurised oxygen. So they were still alive, but unfortunately, as you know, they all perished. The reaction of the people. And about 1 minute later, the controllers found that they had lost the spaceship Challenger. You know, the Challenger sort of reminds us of the fact that life is incredibly fragile, isn't it? You know, who would have known that as the astronauts were walking out, that this will be their last day on Earth? Life is incredibly fragile. And for us as Seventh-day Adventists, today is the day of salvation. And in that fragility of life, We don't know what's going to happen around the corner. But what we do know is that our lives will end one way or another. And it will either end when we get too old or hit by a bus or whatever. Or might be the second coming. And we hope that it is soon. We might see the second coming. Either way, our lives will end. And that tragedy of those 8 astronauts lost their lives that day, 73 seconds into their flight. And as the people who watched their loved ones in the space, because they were relatives there, they were watching their loved ones taking off and expecting them to arrive back in about a week's time, as they were going to launch a couple of satellites. But as they looked up, they saw the space shuttle explode. Not knowing for a split second what was happening at that moment, but they quickly realised that they had lost their loved ones. We will lose loved ones. We will eventually lose our life through old age or through the second coming. But what of productivity between now and that? What is our response to God's grace that He has given His all to us that we might live? He has given everything. And what was amazing about this parable, immediately they went out. You might have 1 talent, you might have 1.5, 0.5, 5 talents, 10 talents. What are you going to do with them? Let us purpose in our minds in response to God's grace that we may give our lives in service to Him and do our best laying what we do have on the altar because of His wonderful grace.